Welcome, everyone, to the fourth annual Emerging Scholars Symposium, a partnership brought to you specifically by the Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower Presidential Libraries, and we listed them in the order that they served, but more broadly by the National Archives and Records Administration, of which the presidential libraries are an important part. The Emerging Scholars Symposium is the brainchild of my friend and colleague, Joy Murphy, who is the education director at the Eisenhower Presidential Library. And this is a program that brings you, the viewer, cutting edge insight and information from a group of scholars who are relatively new to the world of research, scholarship, and presentation of their findings on a national stage. In this case, it's actually an international stage. So we're getting in on the ground floor of what I'm sure is going to be some very interesting and fascinating careers in the world of research, writing, and education. I'm Jeff Urban. I'm the education director at the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park, New York. I'll be your host and moderator for today's session, and I'm so pleased that you've taken the time to join us, and we're going to be doing this again tomorrow, so please tune in there as well. The theme for this year's Emerging Scholar Symposium is Waging Peace. And I would like to point out that is exactly what each of the three presidents who are associated with this symposium were seeking to do. Though they are associated with the Second World War, the Korean War, and the Cold War, each of those presidents was trying to bring about peace among all peoples and peace among all nations. That was at the core of their administrations. Now, next up, we're going to hear from Mariia Kravchenko. Mariia is a Ukrainian Americanist and program officer at Fulbright, Ukraine, and Institute of International Education in the Kyiv office. She earned her PhD in history from the Taras Shevchenko University of Kyiv, and her primary research interests are U.S. domestic politics, focusing on reforms of Harry S. Truman and Franklin Roosevelt. She is working virtually from Kyiv on expanding the network of scholars and research institutions abroad with an ambitious plan to lift Ukrainian American studies to new levels. Before we begin, I just want to say she's joining us from Kyiv in the Ukraine, and there it is 9 o'clock. They have, because of the situation they're in right now, scheduled power outages, and we may be experiencing one in just a few moments. If that happens, we'll lose power for probably 2, maybe 3 minutes. She'll get right back on as soon as the power comes on, and we'll continue on with our talk. So just puts in perspective, the differences in people's lives in different places in the world. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Mariia to you. Go ahead, Mariia. Tell us about what you're working on.
Thank you, Jeff, for such a nice introduction. First of all, I would like to thank to the organizers, Eisenhower, Roosevelt, and Truman Presidential Libraries, and for the chance to present here at the Emergency Scholars Symposium. Special gratitude goes to Director of Learning and Engagement at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, Joy Murphy, who assisted and supported me as far as possible, and also to Jeff Urban, who is moderating this conversation today. I hope that we will not have a lot of problems because of power outage, but anyway, I will return in a few minutes if that happens. So today I'm going to present the topic that is about US intellectual concerns over the Soviet Union in 1946. Next slide, please. And so with the end of World War II, the turbulent times for global security were not in the past. Peace seemed to be fragile and uncertain because of intensive deterioration of US-Soviet relations, and nobody knew what that could be resulted in. And as we also live in turbulent times, it seems to me it's essential to keep in mind how the US intellectual diplomats, policymakers were looking for an appropriate response to Soviet threats and formulating possible ways of coexistence which still could be determined as peace. As I'm going to present based mainly on the primary sources, I will give only a few general comments on historiography of the problem. So the wide scope of the works where the intellectual works of the early Cold War period are mentioned, analyzed, is presented in the books dedicated to Harry Truman and his presidency period. In preparing of this presentation, I worked mainly with Alonso's Hamby works, Robert Farrell's, and other. More attention to the problems were given the works about the Cold War and the issue of containment in general, with focusing as a rule mainly on George Kennan's legacy. At the same time, some additional information for this research was found in John Gaddy's book, The Cold War and New History. And talking about historiographical shift, I will only mention that the big shift happened in 60s in the works of so-called revisionist historians, and even more in the school of New Lefts. Basically, this research was conducted on the primary sources, Riel's collections at the Roosevelt Institute for American Studies in Middelburg, the Netherlands. Working there last summer with a totally different aim. I was looking for documents on domestic reforms of Roosevelt-Truman years. I was inspired to look at the Edward Willet report included in the President Harry Truman's office files, 1945-1953, Riel's collection, part 3. Later, when I saw an announcement for the Imagined Scholar Symposium, I returned to my notes on this and used the online collections of the Truman Library for more sources, and finally formulated my ideas as this presentation. So this research is created in a narrative way, I would say, built in chronological order, and I am thankful to both RIAS in the Netherlands and the Truman Presidential Library for making it possible to me to read these sources. Next slide, please. Probably the single most important problem of confronting the world today is that of international peace. This is a quote from the introductory part of the report prepared by a scholar, Edward Willet. In fact, the first intellectual paper on the global security threats in the post-World War II era that emerged on January 14, 1946, a month before the Kennan's long telegram. Next slide, please. The report called Dialectical Materialism and Russian Objectives, and was the original author's attempt to give some guidance for future Russian-American relationships based on analysis of communism and its role in Soviet Russia. Willett was looking for the answers on the following questions. Do the tenets of communism necessarily mean war between the US and Russia, or do they hold forth the possibility of attaining the peaceful modus vivendi for this nation and the whole world? It was amazing for me to discover that despite the fact of raising such vital issues in his report, Edward Willet in no means didn't become a star intellectual of the Cold War era like George Kennan, for example. Moreover, even to find his professional biography was a challenge because the information is very fragmentary. So what I found in time was writing the report, Edward Willet was a research assistant to James Forrestal, Secretary of Navy, who played the key role in disseminated this Willet's report. Before and after his 15 months position close to the US government in times of World War II, Willet was a scholar and taught economics. He graduated from Princeton and was teaching there and also at the Smith College. He also was active on Wall Street, and all his later famous book in co-authorship with Robert Parris were dedicated exactly to economics, its history and the history of Wall Street. As I mentioned, for John Forrestal, Willet's report was the first intellectual guide in the issues of Soviet nature, and he did everything he could to spread it among the members of Truman cabinet. But in fact, it was the long telegram by Kennan arrived a few weeks later that became a milestone document for the US-Soviet relations. Kennan himself also read the report by Willet and was very critical about its so-called alarmism and exaggerations. According to Gaddis, at the same time, this report pushed Kennan to write another famous paper, the X article in Foreign Affairs magazine of 1947. In all this process of creating, John Forstall played the role of, let's say, PR manager or literally agent who understood the importance of research and analysis of the Soviet Union itself and its foreign policy and US-Russian relations. In 1947, he became the first secretary of the newly created Department of Defense, and in some way, it was President Truman's recognition of all his early activities in this field. Returning to Willet's report, I'd like to note that the half of it was dedicated to the analysis of communism as an official Soviet ideology. He starts from historical overview of dialectical materialism as its background and shows its application in the fields which, according to him, are the most important in considering US-Soviet relations, the fields of history, of the state, religion, morality, revolution, and society. Willet summarizes this part with exactly the answer to a question about the reasons for deterioration of the US-Soviet relations. He says that the nature of the communism contains the seeds of inevitable vital conflict between communism and capitalistic democracy. This ideology is aimed on a violent worldwide revolution which should bring an ideal society without a property state. So the only chance to peaceful coexistence, Edward Willet considered in finding the way to see if the Soviet rulers were true fans and followers of the communist philosophy or not. And the author dedicates his second part of the report on answering this question and calling it Russian objectives. One of the most interesting thoughts of this part is the analysis of Russian objective in surrounding herself with ring of satellites running from former Baltic states down through Central Europe and the Balkans. As he underlines that it is unclear whether these satellites are intended to be a sort of cordon sanitaire to protect Russia from capitalist nations, or whether they are intended to serve as a springboard for attack. This argument he uses to prove that those who believe that Russia is not motivated by original communist ideals are wrong, and even compare them with those who didn't care about the official Nazi ideology before the World War II. The last part of the report is called Communism versus Democracy, the Future.
Okay, it looks like we've temporarily lost our feed to Mariia. I want to assure everyone we have not lost Mariia. This was a scheduled power outage in her country due to the situation that's going on there. And she informed us that this was likely to occur sometime around 9 or 9:15 their time. So that's exactly what we're experiencing right now. Her family has made arrangements to have a generator, and they are in the process right now, I'm sure, of running up and down the stairs, hooking up batteries and cables and those sorts of things, just like we do when our power goes out here in the United States as well. So I assure you she's in no danger, just a momentary glitch in the power situation. Before we go any further, though, we wait for her to come back. I just want to, say how impressed I am with these scholars who are doing this research from all around the world. And I remember when I taught high school, the kids say, "Oh, I wasn't able to get to the library. I wasn't able to get on the internet." And when you see these scholars doing this research from all the far-off corners of the world, tapping into the rich resources of the National Archives and Records Administration, the Truman Library, the Eisenhower Library, the Roosevelt Presidential Library, they're doing it all remotely. They're doing it from far-off corners of the world, and they're getting the information that they need. This information that they're getting is so critically important because it is the foundation upon which they are making their arguments. So primary source documents, of course, the authentic original document is a fantastic place to begin to build your argument, right? Certainly, all documents are up to interpretation. You spin it one way, I spin it the other. But when we can get back to the primary source document, that's where we have a combined agreement that, okay, this is where this starts. And then we can begin with that, add other documents along the way, add our interpretation, and build our arguments. And our arguments are built on authentic information, authentic documentation. This is part of what we call media literacy, right? Critical thinking. The ability to find documents, the ability to analyze documents, the ability to interpret documents, and then the ability to place those documents in a context with other information, primary source documents, interviews, anything else that you might be able to bring in that is of authentic value, and then build the argument. And when I say argument, I don't mean like, fighting kind of an argument. I mean, here's my position, right? And as Mariia is sharing with us, she's looking at this information that came out after the end of the Second World War with the Cold War to see, were we going to be able to have a peaceful relationship with the Soviet Union or not? And it was anybody's ball game at that point. But as Mariia is pointing out, going back and looking at these things such as, the ideological aspect, the history of the state, the morality, the economy, these sorts of things, you begin to get a sense about what is motivating the other side. And when you can do that, when you can get a sense of what the other guy is thinking, then you can begin to put yourself in their shoes a little bit, and you can begin to look for things that you have in common and things that unite you, not necessarily things that are going to divide you. And again, the use of primary sources, from archives and institutions all over the world, so critically important, especially in this day and age of so-called fake news and those sorts of things. So we're waiting for Mariia to return to us, to get her generators going, put the gerbil back on the wheel, and get the power back up. It is something that's going on there, she says, as a regular occurrence, and her family has taken some measures to mitigate that. Sadly, because of the time difference, it happens to come during this presentation here, but I'm sure she'll be back in just a moment or two. In the meantime, if you have any questions about the Presidential Library System or the National Archives, and you want to chat, type them into the chat, I'd be happy to answer maybe some of those questions, and get a sense of what you have on your mind while we wait for Mariia to return. And I see one here. How did the presidential libraries become part of the National Archives? Well, that's a great question. Our presidential library, the Roosevelt Presidential Library, was actually the first presidential library in the presidential library system. And President Roosevelt believed that the documents of the presidents were very important. The very first president, George Washington, of course, took his papers with him when he left office with the idea of organizing those papers so they could be used by future presidents. He passed away before he had a chance to do that, and we lost a great deal of our presidential history. President Roosevelt, who said, hey, we're going through a Great Depression here. People are going to want to know how we got through this 100 years from now. He offered his papers to the Library of Congress as part of the public record, and the Library of Congress simply didn't have enough space. President Roosevelt had in his collection about 17.5 million pages of documents. That would be a stack 16 times as tall as the Washington Monument. And I don't have an exact number, but I believe the National Archives today is responsible for something like 40 billion pages of records. So Roosevelt decided, okay, you don't have the space, I will build my own presidential library. I'll put my papers here. And that became the model by which all the subsequent presidential libraries have been built. But what you can see through the scholars in this program, the emerging scholars, is that the presidential libraries are a fantastic source to find information coming across the presidencies. Oh, looks like Mariia is back, so I'm going to turn it back over to her. But if you want to know more information about presidential libraries, contact us. Go ahead, Mariia. We're glad you're back.
Oh, thank you.
Looks like a little glitch, just probably a little technical glitch and maybe a kink in one of the wires. We'll see if we can get her back here again. But contact your local presidential library if you want to know more information about the presidency, about the times that those presidents served, and contact your local presidential library and National Archives location. Of course, we have our headquarters in DC, where the Charters of Freedom are, and you can find out all kinds of information from tapping into the National Archives. So we had Mariia back for just a second there, but it looks like she has faded off again. So I'll continue my story about the presidential libraries. So Roosevelt is the first to build one. He builds it with private money. It doesn't cost the public anything to build a presidential library. And that becomes the pattern by which all presidents and the model by which all presidents then build presidential libraries from that point. So we start with the Roosevelt Presidential Library, and we work our way all the way on up to the Obama Presidential Library. Now, some of you smart, sharp historians out there are likely to say, wait a minute, isn't there a Hoover Presidential Library? And there is. President Hoover, of course, was president before Franklin Roosevelt, and he found himself with some free time after 1933, right, when FDR kicks him out of office. So he went back and he built the presidential library much later. And so if you go in chronological order, they start with President Hoover and work their way up. But if you go in the order that they were actually created, the Roosevelt Presidential Library is the first. And I think you can see by this wonderful program that Joy Murphy has put together now for the 4th year in a row, that there's very little competition between the presidential libraries, whether they be Republican presidents or Democratic presidents, because the information, the material, the primary sources, the people's right to know is the overriding thing that goes all throughout the National Archives. And so where one person's story ends, the next story picks up, because so many of these issues spanned across several presidential administrations and such. So to get a sense of what the guy in office before you did will give you an insight into what it is you're going to do. And that is exactly what the Presidential Library idea was all about when Washington created that himself back when he left office. Now, when Washington left office, he started the tradition of taking papers with you, and that created the tradition that the presidential papers belonged to the president. And that was kept all the way on up through Jimmy Carter. And the problem was after the Nixon situation with Watergate, there was some question as to, do the papers belong to the president? Are they his personal papers, or do we need to have the information for the public? So there was a tussle back and forth. There was a Supreme Court case, People of the United States versus Richard Nixon, and it was decided that the papers belong to us. So there was a change in the law, the Presidential Papers Act, which now makes the papers of the president the property of the people of the United States. So we no longer have to worry about that. And that information is kept, it's cataloged, it is taken care of, and it is made accessible so that we can find out what our government is doing on behalf of us, we the people, which happens to be the first three words of the Constitution, which is, of course, one of our charters of freedom, along with the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. Speaking of the Declaration of Independence, upcoming is the 250th anniversary, can you believe it already, of our Declaration of Independence, and the National Archives and Records Administration will be hosting a wide variety of activities in celebration and commemoration of that. And stay tuned for that. But more importantly, here comes Mariia again.
I'm sorry, Jeff. It's unexpectedly low internet before the outage. So we still have electricity here, but low internet. But I switched to another source, so everything should be fine. Just let me know where I was interrupted.
You did a great job. You were talking about whether the satellite states surrounding the Soviet Union would be a buffer to protect the Soviet Union, or whether they would be used as a springboard to expand Soviet aggression. And the true understanding of the communist ideology was what was going to drive that. So that's where you were, as far as where I was keeping notes.
Okay, so thank you so much for being so attentive. So this argument that you mentioned, Willet uses to prove that those who believe that Russia isn't motivated by original communist ideals are wrong, and even compares them with those who didn't care about the official Nazi ideology before the World War II. And the last part of the report is called Communism versus Democracy, the Future. Willet sees the prospects of peace in the circumstances of failures of communists inside Russia and so-called satellite countries, in poverty and economic problem of Soviet society, and believes in so-called realpolitik by Joseph Stalin. What he recommends to America was to keep herself in a strong defensive position. Probably the lack of the instruction of what to do to achieve the desirable modus vivendi to protect a peace with more specifications than just to be defensive was one of the reasons of not becoming the Willet report the star paper of the decade. Next slide, please. The next paper I'm going to analyze today is totally different by its background and style. I'm talking about the articles in the New York Times by Brooks Atkinson, appeared on July 7th, 8th, and 9th of 1946. Also, we are not enemies. Here we go. Sorry, guys. Also, we are not enemies. We are not friends. And the most we can hope for is an armed peace for the next few years. I think it's a brilliant quote from Atkinson's thoughts, which are even partly used in the title of this presentation, because it truly reflects the spirit of those times. The next slide, please. So, Brooks Atkinson, at the time of publishing his articles on Soviet Union, was a well-known theater critic for at least 2 decades. Graduated from Harvard, he worked at the New York Times drama desk since 1920s. With the beginning of World War II, Atkinson switched his specialization and was sent by the New York Times to China, where he covered the war until 1945. By the way, he favorably wrote about the Chinese Communist Party. After World War II, after a short time at home, he was sent to Soviet Union to serve as a press correspondent in Moscow. That is how appeared his 3 articles in the New York Times and Soviet Union, for which he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1947. After his Moscow trip, he returned to the drama desk, where he continued his successful drama critic career. So his papers were totally different from previously analyzed in this presentation. Unlike Willet, he wrote for a wide audience, didn't use a lot of specific terminology, and rested mainly on what he saw by his eyes being in Moscow. From the first lines, he separates Russian people, but not Soviet peoples because there were many. He describes them as admirable, hardworking, and practical, and the Soviet government, a totalitarian government, so-called apparatus, the terminology that wasn't presented in Willet's report. Probably this apparatus term was not familiar to Willet. Also, just from the first line, Atkinson gives a very clear method of how US should deal with Soviets in foreign affairs. Where our interests lie, we have to apply equal power in the opposite direction. This is the most reactionary method of arranging world affairs, but the spirit of the Soviet government is fundamentally reactionary. Accustomed to the use of power force inside the Soviet Union, the Soviet government instinctively thinks in terms of force in its external affairs. Like Kennan, he tries to show the reasons of why it's so hard to deal with Russians. What differs his pieces from others, that is his deep attention to the interior issues of Soviet policy. He describes in detail and with some numbers of the sufferings of Soviet people from their own government. He says about 15 million of political prisoners. For American citizens, it was hard to understand and realize, but at least to delight it in such a talented way was important. Atkinson sees one of the hardships of the Soviets in its leaders' ignorance and self-isolation. Only one detail here. The report of Mr. Churchill's speech at Fulton was not published in the Soviet Union for a few days, while the Soviet leaders were deciding how to handle it. When finally they did publish it with simultaneous comment, Moscow received a hysterically, as if the atomic bombs might start dropping before midnight. Again, opposite to Willet, who saw communism as a powerful ideological background for Soviets. Atkinson, based on his first-hand experience, said about the lack of ideological, at least novelty. There are no new ideas in Moscow, and the old ones are repeated with stupid regulatory. At the same time, he shares Willet's concerns about what ideology and totalitarian regime do with its people, and propose some advice for U.S. government for creating some adequate responses in their domestic policies. He says that we have to increase production and raise standards of living on a dynamic scale. Our basic problem is how to organize for maximum production without infringing on the Bill of Rights. Because the fact that there was no unemployment in the Soviet Union was at the same time the fact that it was in no means the wish of Soviet people to be involved in that processes that pushed this no existence of unemployment. Brooks Atkinson obviously were said less about potential war conflict between US and Soviet Union, but his works were bright in familiarizing Americans with life in Soviet Union, given the answer why Russians are so hard, and clear statements that any friendship with Soviets is dangerous illusion. Whether we like it or not, we are competitors for influence on the rest of the whole world. The next paper, please. The final paper I'm going to analyze in this presentation is definitely more familiar in historiography of the early Cold War years. I'm talking about the report to the President Truman by the Special Counsel Clark Clifford, which saw the American relations with the Soviet Union as the gravest problem facing the United States. This next slide, please. Thank you. This research emerged on September 24th, 1946, and known when it was declassified as Clifford-Elsey report. Clark Clifford was a lawyer before the World War II, practicing in St. Louis since 1928. He served as an officer in the US Navy since 1944, and Captain Clifford was appointed as a White House counsel, in fact, very close advisor to President Truman in 1946. Stayed at this position till the end of the decade, and later obtained the high posts at the Kennedy and Johnson's administrations. In fact, the preparing and success among the policy makers of the report, called officially American Relations with the Soviet Union, made him one of the influential politicians of his time. Few words about George Elsey, the co-author, and by many historians the main author of the report. In 1946, he was assistant to Clark Clifford, previously served as commander in the US Naval Reserve, had degrees in history from Princeton and Harvard, and as historians like writing. And so nothing surprising that he made a big part of the Clifford-Elsey report. At the same time, it was Clifford whose role, position, and influence made it possible to take it into account by the US government. And at the highest foreign policy level. Interesting fact I found in the book by John Acacia that Harry Truman had a very limited assignment in mind when he requested this report. Elsey convinced Clifford, who in turn convinced Truman that a more comprehensive study was needed. The report is consisted of 81 pages with 6 chapters. It deals with the foundations of the Soviet foreign policy, which again insists on inevitable conflict between the USSR and the US, reminds about the Soviet-American agreements in wartime, and shows very clearly violations of by Soviets those agreements. The third chapter is specifically important because there were listed all the problems arose till September 25th, 1946. The principal violations concerned Germany, Austria, the Balkan countries, Iran, Korea, and these agreements. Separate chapter was dedicated to the reparation issue confrontation, and as final parts were the chapters on Soviet activities affecting American security and the United States policy toward the Soviet Union. I think that Clifford-Elsey report can be considered as a summary for all previous intellectual discussions, observations, and papers on post-war foreign policy of the Soviet Union and US-Soviet relation dating till the end of 1946, because it covered all issues and concerns raised before. Moreover, Clifford consulted the Secretary of State, Secretary of War, the Attorney General, the Secretary of Navy, the Director of Central Intelligence, diplomats like George Kennan and Charles Boyle, and some other persons who had the knowledge in the field. Yet it incorporated a lot of ideas from Lon Terriman, Willet report, in terms of ideological issues, and fact and venues that were going on around the world. Finally, the very clear primary objective of the United States was formulated right in Clifford-Elsey report. It was to convince Soviet leaders that it is in the Soviet interest to participate in a system of world cooperation. With obvious seeking for peace, these documents, without repeating Atkinson's citation, was about an armed peace. This government must, as a first step toward world stabilization, seek to prevent additional Soviet aggression. The greater the area controlled by Soviet Union, the greater the military requirements of this country will be. The language of military power is the only language which disciples of power politics understand. The next slide, please. Thank you. In my conclusions, I'd like to underline that based on this analyzed documents, it's obvious that 1946 became a year of realizing by US intellectuals, diplomats, policymakers of the threats from the Soviet Union to global peace, and a year of attempts to formulate the new agenda for the US-Soviet relations. It doesn't even matter who was the first, Willet or Kennan, or how many people at the Truman administration read the whole Clifford-Elsey report. But what was really essential that is the fact that due these works and ideas formulated in them, they just summarized what was in the air. And they were not, and the authors were not afraid to present a very hard line in U.S. foreign policy, and they were not waiting for more clearly times for their analysis. So, what does it mean waging peace for Willet, Atkinson, and Clifford back in 1946? I summarize it in 3 key features that are relevant for all 3 papers. The first one is study everything as much as possible about your opponent. The second one is be ready to accept the truth about your opponent's intentions, even if you don't believe it from the first time. And the third one is to be courage to prepare adequate responses if they ever will be needed. I'm finishing my presentation with interpretation of famous Truman works, The Buck Stops Here. So you see, and where the buck was stopped. So in my opinion, these intellectual works of 1946 helped to stop Buck in 1947 with announcing the Truman Doctrine, with National Security Act of 1947, and further initiatives that were understood in the framework of policy containment. Political steps had a huge analytical background, and analysis prepared in those papers help to build a peaceful future. So that was waging peace in terms of 1946. Thank you.
Very nice, Mariia. Thank you. And thanks for being a real trooper going through the power outages and the rest of that. Fascinating, discussion here. And it's interesting how quickly this sort of gelled between 1945 and 1947. But one of the things that we always have to deal with here at the Roosevelt Library is when we talk about the big 3, right? Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill during the war. And everybody always acts like, well, these guys were all hand in glove, working together, making things happen and such. And it's not always true. I mean, you had one guy, Churchill, who's running an empire. You've got the United States, Roosevelt is running a democracy, and you've got the Soviet Union, which is a dictatorship. So do you think that it's possible that, so it's this idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So
I'm sorry, Jeff. Just few minutes for me. I will switch to another. As you see, I don't have electricity now, so I switch into another. I will be in 1 minute here. Okay.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. Okay, she'll be back. The question I want to ask her is, it seems like, we got along with the Soviets because we had to defeat Hitler. And I'm wondering if that didn't lead us to believe that the relationship was much better than it actually was. There you are. All set?
Yeah. I hear you well, see you well, and can answer the questions, but I'm sorry, I need to hear it again because it was interrupted.
No problem. You're doing a great job. Given the situation. So we were kind of friends with the Soviets during the war, during the United States, the Allies, during the Second World War, because we had a common enemy, Hitler. Do you think that that we may have sort of relied too heavily on thinking that we were going to just be able to end the war and then live peacefully with the Soviet Union? Were our expectations too high from the Soviet Union at the end of the war, do you think?
Thank you for your questions. Probably your questions is on the intersections of, what is always mentioned. Sorry, that is air alert here. Don't worry about that. That is actually what is every time I'm finding in books when some historians are claiming about, especially what I found it in Soviet books, that Roosevelt administration was more favorable to Soviets, and so with Roosevelt we could deal, and I'm talking about Soviet historians. And what is not so obvious in this issue that for Truman, it was also not the purpose and for his administration to deteriorate that relations. What I think is true here that due to such intellectual works, it became more clear that expectations like following the wartime agreements and to be friends as nations were not applicable to Soviet foreign policy at all. And for Americans, it was discovery. And that discovery was going during the first post-war years, in fact. And these intellectuals mentioned here today in presentation played a key role to prepare Truman administration and, let's say, American people to understand the new reality in what their former friend, alike, who helped and did a lot in victory of the USSR and US, it was not friend anymore. And for me, it's very essential that these authors were brave in some way because, let's say, it was not popular thing to look for new enemies, but they did their work and found courage in themselves to present what really threats were going from the Soviet Union. In general, I don't think that they early Cold War period can be characterized by thinking about Soviet Union in a worse way than it was in nature itself.
Mm-hmm.
It was even worse.
It was worse. Now, you say that the Elsey report and Clark Clifford, and you make an interesting observation that, Clark Clifford had an influence all the way into the Johnson and Kennedy administrations. He had a hand in what was going on in Vietnam. But you say that this report that they pulled out was really a summary of what was in the air. Do you think that these guys may have had an over or outsized influence in the way things were being done by what they were pulling out of the air, or were they, in your estimation, were they objective about what they were pulling out of the air, or were they pulling out of the air what they wanted to pull out of the air?
Even in introductory part, Clifford, it is proved that part he wrote by himself. He writes to Truman a letter when he lists all people who gave him some insights for preparing this report. And I listed in my presentation a few first lines, but it was really impressive list. So probably not in the air in terms of, let's say, broad American audience society, but in terms of administration, in terms of cabinet, I guess it was like in the air. Because it was not only canon, and it's another amazing thing that I wanted to underline. I don't know how about you guys, US scholars and researchers, but here in Ukraine, we study Cold War period. Of course, it's very different from the studies this period during Soviet Ukraine by Soviet historians, but in general, nobody here knows about Clifford report. I am not saying even about Willet of Atkinson, but everybody knows only about George Kennan. And for me, it also was like a big surprise to find how many other peoples were thinking just the same things. Because when what inspired me for this presentation, it was accidentally look at Willet report at the reels in Netherlands. And I was looking, wow, that is so similar to Canon. Then I was reading and understood that it was published even earlier to Canon. And I didn't never hear about this report. So I guess they were reflective and presenting this what was going on and what was in the air at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Well, the United States, and I don't think this term really came about until maybe a little after the time that we're talking about here, but this idea of realpolitik. When I think of the realpolitik, I think of, to me, it conjures up the Nixon administration, the Kissinger era. But the idea was that, we're going to take a pragmatic approach to the Soviets. We're going to deal with not what we want them to do, but what they're actually doing. And somehow we'll do an awkward dance that will keep everybody on the floor and everybody standing. Were the Soviets looking at it from that perspective, from the other side as well? Or were they looking to take advantage wherever they could?
It's, let's say, not is a question for me. I'm not expert in, is this US strategies. I know that the issues of this real politics are studied by scholars who deal with geopolitics,
Mm-hmm.
and they formulate some foundations of this realpolitik and what it means and how it can be applied. And yes, Kissinger, Nixon, classic examples, but also again about when they are talking about this geopolitics, they are backing again to the end of the World War II. For me, I can't say was Soviet politics a real politic or not, but probably something can be estimated as it, because just like Willet writes, so he believes that according to communism, the war is inevitable. Yes, but he also believes that Stalin was not a truly follower of classic this communist ideology. He believed that if Stalin will not follow this classic philosophy in his deeds, so he will trust to this realpolitik. That means that war is not needed, and so that's the way to wage in peace. And at the same time, even in this Clifford report, Elsie Clifford report, we can see when they summarizing what to do, what U.S. government should do. They also say, first of all, do everything possible that it will be in not Soviet interest to start the war. So again, some kinds of realpolitik, they don't call it in this name, but they see it as a way.
Okay, so we've got a couple of minutes left, and I want to ask you, Mariia, how do you do it? The hour that we've been talking with here, you've cut out twice because of power issues. You are in a very troubled spot in the world. You've got a beautiful smile. You seem to be very with it and very upbeat about it and excited about what it is that you're studying and sharing with us. How do you continue that in an environment like you're in at the current time? I mean, the power outages. I'm sure there's other things that are going on. How are you managing? Are you doing okay?
First of all, thank you for your kind words. At the same time, I'm not alone with it. I'm not the only Ukrainian scholar who works in these circumstances. Probably during the time of this war, we found some ways to be resistant and to find some ways to have always some backup plans. I'm not perfect in managing, but let's say inside of myself, I'm always ready that something can go not under the plan. And if that happens, then I try to do something in another way. No, for example, today the schedule of outage showed that the outage should start just at the beginning of presentation, but unfortunately, even lower internet was before that. And also we had air alert. Not always air alert means actual missile attacks, but sometimes it happened. We also, let's say, got used to that. And what to say? I see this scholarly work as a very big part of myself, because primary I working not as scholar, but as program officer at Fulbright Ukraine. I'm helping to other scholars with the academic exchanges, and organizing, just like you, some online panel discussions, and never present by myself, because all our scholars basically concentrated not on the topics of US history, but on Ukraine, economics, warfare, what's else? Some environmental challenges, a lot of things. But actually, I'm always assisting to others. But last year, I was happy to receive this trip, scholarly trip to the Roosevelt Institute in Middelburg. And it gave me some inspiration and confidence in myself as a scholar. So from time to time, I'm trying not to lose the opportunity to participate in such events as this. Probably in general, this presentation that I presented is only the beginning of some article, let's say, or paper, because as you mentioned, that I'm focusing all my scholarly life on other issues. I'm working with social policies of FDR and Truman, and that is book I'm working on. But at the same time, I think that this presentation gave me more prospects for wider issues. Probably I will try to publish it in some journal. We'll see.
That's great. Well, we look forward to seeing it, and you've laid a wonderful foundation for understanding what was going on in that turbulent period, as these two former allies, now, as you say, not friends but not enemies, were learning how to make their way on the planet together, with so many millions of lives hanging in the balance. And we have an expression here in this country when we have students and they don't do their homework, the student will come in and say, "Oh, my dog ate my homework," and use that as an excuse not to have completed the assignment. But I will never let a student get away with that again. I will say, "Well, my friend Mariia went through an air warning, a power outage, and an internet outage, and still got her report through and still made her point." So absolutely amazing, Mariia. Thank you so much. Please be
Thank
safe.
you.
Keep up the scholarship. The work you're doing is fantastic, and we look forward to reading more about it when you finish your piece.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It was great.
Couldn't have done it without you. Thank you so much.